Okay, it's time to talk about biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles are the environmental cycles that exchange matter between organisms. Organisms have to not just exchange energy, but they have to exchange matter with the environment to grow, reproduce, and maintain organization. That was one of the enduring understandings we wanted to impart. And this is something every biologist has to understand. Obviously, a lot of people don't understand the exchanging carbon thing here. This is all about, or it's part of, the problem we have with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The people that don't believe in climate change haven't read. The problem is they just don't read, so you don't know what the details are. And eventually, when enough people read about what's happening, they will finally say, "Oh, well, yeah, I've always believed that." Is something that is obvious. But right now, we're in the middle of the great debate. The greatest carbon source on Earth is deposited in limestone and petroleum. Although we're not really releasing that much limestone carbon back into the air, we're releasing lots of petroleum carbon back in the air. The dissolution of limestone due to the acidity of rain does produce some carbon dioxide gas, but that's dwarfed in comparison to combustion of fossil fuels, which does the same thing. Now, it has a huge impact on Earth, but it turns out that living things themselves, not counting the rocks and petroleum, living things are exchanging carbon between each other. Carbon dioxide gas is available to biological systems, which is mainly producers from the air. Atmospheric carbon dioxide makes up about 400 parts per million and climbing in the atmosphere. It's about 415 right now and climbing. So the 415 parts per million carbon dioxide in the air is available carbon that the plants can use to store solar energy. They need those carbon atoms to build a molecule that's stable that we can build cathedrals out of. Ultimately, when we burn the foodstuffs that the plants have made, we end up releasing carbon dioxide back into the air. So photosynthesis and respiration complement each other. Plants produce oxygen and take in carbon dioxide from the air. Animals use oxygen and put carbon dioxide back into the air. So ultimately, photosynthesis is taking the CO2 out of the air, and respiration and deforestation and stuff puts carbon in the air. The problem right now we're having is we've got this other arrow here. We're adding carbon in and nothing has been added to take the carbon back out. And it's eventually going to cause major problems. The atmospheric CO2 definitely was involved in at least 4 of the 5 mass extinctions that have happened on Earth in the past. And we know this from radiometric and chemical analysis of sedimentary deposits around the world. So if we keep raising the CO2 level, we're going to be doing what the Deccan traps helped to do to the dinosaurs when they erupted. Anytime massive volcanic activity occurs, you get lots of CO2 going in the air. That warms the planet and causes catastrophes. But then after the mass extinction, other animals evolve. So don't worry, after we're gone, something else will take over. The next of the great cycles we need to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. Now this cycle, unlike the carbon cycle, which you can't do much for the carbon cycle on your lawn, you can't add carbon to the lawn. The plants on your lawn take the carbon dioxide out of the air free of charge as long as they get sunlight. Nitrogen, on the other hand, is something that has to be added to the soil somehow or plants will die. Unfortunately for plants, they can't use nitrogen gas in the air the way they can use carbon dioxide gas in the air. So how do plants get nitrogen? The main source of plant nitrogen is either ammonia or nitrate, and that's in short supply in soil. So the nitrogen cycle is the cycle of compounds between atmospheric nitrogen and soil nitrogen and nitrogen compounds in water. So the main source of nitrogen on Earth is atmospheric nitrogen gas. Unlike carbon, which is in the ground, most of Earth's nitrogen is in the air. Azotobacter, and cyanobacteria in aquatic and marine systems, and rhizobium in terrestrial systems basically suck nitrogen gas in and kick out ammonia. This is called nitrogen fixation, and that's on the left side of the diagram here. Atmospheric nitrogen becoming ammonia is nitrogen fixation. Okay. Now that ammonia so when nitrogen fixation occurs, the ammonia is available to be used to make amino acids by plants. Animals can't use it, but plants and bacteria can use the ammonia to make amino acids. So it turns out, though, that's not the end of the story for the nitrogen cycle. Nitrifying bacteria such as Nitrosomonas convert the ammonia to nitrites, and other nitrifying bacteria known as Nitrobacter convert the nitrites to nitrates. Plants absorb nitrates and ammonia and use them to make proteins. Bacteria such as Pseudomonas convert the nitrates back to nitrogen gas, which is denitrification. The decomposers also break down the proteins of dead material back to ammonia, which then can go back into the nitrogen cycle all over again. The nitrogen cycle is pretty important because it's a major limiting factor in terrestrial systems, and it's an important limiting factor in aquatic systems. Let's go back. Oh, we're not in the right spot. Okay, let's go back there. All right. The nitrogen gas that's in the air can't be directly used by much of anything except for a few types of bacteria, like Rhizobium or Azotobacter, and cyanobacteria. They can suck the nitrogen out of the air and make ammonia. The ammonia can be directly used by plants. It can be picked up by plants, sucked up in the roots, or the ammonia can enter the next steps of the nitrogen cycle. It can get converted to nitrites and then to nitrates. Nitrification is the conversion of ammonia to nitrites. The conversion of nitrites to nitrates is also nitrification. Nitrates being sucked up by plants, that's assimilation. And then ultimately decomposition returns the nitrogen in the form of ammonia back into the nitrogen cycle in the soil when organisms, dead bodies, break down. So that all the nitrogen in the air doesn't disappear, some nitrogen compounds like nitrates are denitrified back to nitrogen gas in the air. The thing is, if you have a lawn or a crop that you're trying to grow, if you don't get nitrogen in the soil, plants without nitrogen can't make proteins and then can't make enzymes and structural material in their bodies, and they end up suffering as a result. So your lawn looks terrible with lots of dirt exposure because the plants can't grow. That's why most people put fertilizer on their lawn to give the plants a nitrogen source so that they can make enzymes and do the things they need to do. So the nitrogen cycle is really important to terrestrial systems for growth. On the other hand, if there's too much nitrogen and phosphate in an aquatic system, the water becomes unusable by almost anything. So unlike on land where you can grow luxurious crops with lots of nitrogen, if you put lots of nitrogen in water, the water putrefies. It gets loaded with algae, and at night the algae die, and the whole lake becomes a decomposition system with decomposing algae consuming all the oxygen that's available in the lake. Then all the fish suffocate and die, and the whole lake dies. Lake death, which comes from algal blooms, comes from putting too much nitrogen or phosphate in the water. This is what's happening to the Gulf of Mexico from all the fertilizers running from the American Midwest down the Mississippi River to the Gulf. It's putrefying the Gulf. So large regions of the Gulf have algal blooms and they're completely dead with no life because there's no oxygen in the water. Kind of sad. Now the last part of the cycle here is, or the last of the cycles to talk about, is the phosphorus cycle. Unlike the last two cycles, which have gaseous components, the phosphorus cycle has no gaseous components. Phosphorus it leaches out of rock and becomes available to plants and bacteria and algae so that they can in turn use it to make ATP and make DNA, which contains phosphates. So phosphorus is needed in DNA, RNA, ATP, and phospholipids. It's also a major component of the matrix structural material of bones, shells, and teeth. The biologically active form of phosphorus is phosphate, PO4, HPO4 usually, which plants and animals can absorb. P never occurs as a gas, and it always leaches from rocks, and it's what we call a sedimentary cycle, unlike CNN, which are atmospheric cycles. Phosphorus is usually eroded from rocks as limestone, such as limestone, and it comes out as the phosphate ion. Animals also excrete phosphate in the same form, and plants can suck that right up and use it. Phosphate is often a major limiting factor in lakes and streams and keeps the water clear as long as it's in low supply. If too much phosphate gets into lakes or streams, they putrefy and turn green with algal bloom. So phosphate moves from rock to terrestrial biomes, ultimately to the ocean, and then it deposits out on the ocean floor, and it will not again return to land until ocean sediments, through plate tectonics, are shoved back up onto a land surface and they begin to weather off. So phosphate is retained, thankfully, a long time in topsoil, and it's not easily lost. So usually there's not a lot of phosphate problems on land. The limiting factor in a yard or a field is usually nitrogen or water, not phosphate. There is also a water cycle, but the AP curriculum didn't really talk about it much, but I'm just going to mention it here. Water is a real simple cycle. Liquid water in the oceans is the vast majority of water on Earth. Evaporation, I'm going to represent with E, brings the water vapor from the oceans up in the air. At that point, it condenses, representing C, in the form of clouds. When clouds with condensed tiny water droplets either change altitude rapidly or they hit warm weather fronts, they will drop their condensate or water vapor as precipitation. Precip. So what we have in the cycle is ocean water evaporates, and by the way, it's not just ocean water. In the rainforest, tree transpiration, in other words, tree sweating, also is significant and generates cloud bursts and downpours of rain. Ocean water evaporates to form clouds. Clouds drop rain as precipitation back on the ocean or on the land. And so the water cycle is really important, because if it wasn't for the cycle, you almost could have nothing growing on land. Water doesn't magically show up in a spring. It got there because it rained, probably sometimes years before, or it snowed, and it's up in glaciers. That's one of the great dangers of global warming. A significant number of people on Earth are sustained by glacial snowmelt. If those glaciers all melt, the rivers will run dry. And when the rivers run dry, there's going to be a lot of very unhappy people on Earth, and we're going to have some major problems. The CO2 levels in the air are responsible for a gradual warming of the Earth. They're always responsible for it. It's just funny that nobody, except people in science, people outside of science don't want to believe it. It's happening. Global warming is inevitable if you keep adding a greenhouse gas to the air. Fart in the car smells. Get on with it. Let's figure out what we can do about it. That finishes the biogeochemical cycles. The next thing we got to talk about is water. So let's erase that and let's go to water.